So years ago, when there was some sort of coercive pressure applied to try to compel people to accede to specific kinds of behavioral engineering. See, I'm not going to acknowledge behavioral analysis. I'm not going to acknowledge behavioral testing. I'm not going to behavioral economics, behavioral sciences. It's behavioral engineering. You're trying to engineer people to comply with certain performance indicators associated with demonstrations of behavior. And so, did you coerce or torment or offer to alleviate the pain or the stress and people I used to know were experiencing by playing some psyop with them involving the cyber realm? Would offer them a presentation of some derivation of me, and if they agreed to cooperate with certain things, then it was almost as if what you would give them a reward. Now, part of these allegations include that somebody I used to know who went to school here in Texas made some sort of research study out of this, that this is part of what he did for his PhD. And that I was allowed to be a specific test subject for him personally. And I cannot necessarily confirm that. What I can confirm is that elements of his identity have been replicated and allowed to be redistributed, including to people and in manners I don't think he would approve of, right? And I know I never approved of this, and I would never have approved of you doing this to anybody. So every time you try to do that thing, or somebody tries to do that thing where they swap out an archetype or something that looks like somebody I used to know, but tries to give it a different characterization, I just don't accept that. It's not acceptable. If I meet people and they're different or they look a certain way, or even if they remind me of someone, that's one thing. But you don't get to supplant somebody I used to know with a tweaked out model or a tweaked model that can then be, replicated and or redistributed. You just don't get to do that. I don't accept that. So we had this notice today, presumably these two minors involved in sex trafficking without any details. And then, some of the rationales that are playing out. But there's an actual press release right here on the Department of Justice website. Seventh generic drug manufacturer is charged in ongoing criminal antitrust investigation. Now, part of what is going on with these revelations about what happened with Mr. Navalny in Russia, okay, and with all the things that are going on, including the attempt to try to identify him as like a plant. He's like a figment of the imagination. They just made him up overnight. He didn't really ever do this because I'd never heard of him before. Oh my God, I never heard of him. I haven't known about him for years. Well, obviously, it's just some sort of trick, some sort of psyop. Well, I mean, yes, it is. It's absolutely 100% a psyop. But what kind of a psyop? And my contention is what they've done is he has been put into some sort of state whereby they are attempting to do two things politically. One is they are trying to allow for an intercession into the consciousness of this COVID 19 pandemic for another kind of understanding of what is going on through the lens of political reprisal and the couching of it as being about election interference is only one element of what is actually going on. And there's other things that are usually identified with Russia or the former Soviet Union that are actually happening in other places, including in the United States. I've been contending for a long time that a lot of what is being accused or projected onto Russia, as well as China, it's not necessarily even about Russia or China. What it's about is access to expropriated assets or even some kind of trade connected to assets related to other countries that through mischaracterization and or through miscommunication about existing trade deals, existing tariff schedules, also in understandings of things like countervailing duties and things of this nature, that as these penalties are recirculated into the economy and there's all this tax evasion, and the United States disproportionately refuses to do its part to prevent acts of money laundering. And instead, as I have been watching with absolute abject horror for years, what instead they do is they assess a financial penalty. And then this penalty allows for a recalibration of the scheme, but they never actually stop the racket. Okay, and until hopefully today, right? Today it's irrefutable. They got busted, so something's going to have to recalibrate. Well, how and in what manner? Because I'm looking at this seven generic drug manufacturers charged in ongoing criminal antitrust investigation. The thing about antitrust is it's not just about price fixing as a way of impacting competition. We've got a misrepresentative understanding of what competition entails. We're also talking about potentially criminal activity that come with coercion, extorting, and strong arming other people and innovation, and doing things that are blatantly illegal in order to put people or entities into situations where they're allowed to be made intentionally vulnerable to harvesting and illegal expropriation of things they could otherwise have to take care of themselves and or do something with their talents, skills, and capabilities that they may not agree to if they were told, hey, we need generic drugs. Why do you need generic drugs? Well, people need these medications for cheaper. I don't believe in medication. I don't believe in what your concept of healthcare is, the way that this impacts people biophysiologically and the networks you're in. You share the R&D with weapons companies. If you're making biological weapons, there are processes you have to go through, and they should be, for all kinds of ethical reasons, completely distinct from the healthcare sector. I don't agree to that. Well, okay. And then, 6 months later, they're in the hospital because they got ill? Okay. So a year later, they're getting out of the hospital because they had some treatment for being mentally ill. And now you don't want to talk to them because they're mentally ill. Okay. And so then, you're going through stress in your life and you may or may not accept mental illness. And at some point, somebody shows you a picture that looks a lot like that person. And you're like, oh my God, that's Charity. Oh my God, they're saying that Charity's a child molester. Oh my God. I mean, it's not actually Charity, but it looks just like Charity. Oh my gosh. And there's these things that, oh my gosh, are almost in common with things that I knew about Charity. Oh my God. Maybe she was a child molester. And then there's that thing that's trying to say, well, I mean, and then all of a sudden, Charity gets recharacterized and recalibrated. You see other things that look like Charity and have some element of her identity, but it's not really her. You've created a generic. You've agreed to participate in the consumption of a digital duplicate that in a context of undisclosed regimes of telemedication is actually a consumption of a generic product. And so, especially if you go through certain things sociopolitically, or you're subjected to a period of time where you're divested from new social networks or being able to establish new friendships with people, they try to process these old subroutines with the identities of people you used to know, but they recharacterize them. And as they recharacterize them, they send you these things that are supposed to be projections or manipulations, kind of derivations of those people you used to know. And you're supposed to accept the recharacterization of them. And you're also supposed to agree to or accede to the redistribution. And this is outside of a context of looking at a legal filing and saying, hey, I originally attempted to get some assistance with my investigation of what I allege was illegal activity involving a brokerage that has this particular family name. Hey, that brokerage just issued a bond that was based on manipulation of reports on busting a firefighter accused of child sex abuse. Hey, I'm trying to get this taken care of, and you've illegally confronted me with no other option than to go through a judge that has the same name that I'm trying to get assistance with. Hey, I've done reviews of case laws for the last 20 years and see that there's a specific and strategic pattern of using people with this last name with very specific kinds of charges related specifically to child sex abuse. Hey, yeah, by the way, I used to teach a young girl with that name. Oh, fucking shit. You mean the senator I reported this to has one name and he is a one hurricane, while the girl I used to tutor, who had the same last name before I got involved with any of this fucking shit, has the other first name. Oh, by the way, ever since I was born, you've allowed people to bond me and my life to that very brokerage. Right? Now, what do? Do I accept that young girl I used to teach, who's now 19, or I'm sorry, not 19, she would be what, about 17? 18? Do I accept her being supplanted as, what is supposed to come along? What is supposed to remind me of her, but via ingestion of a generic is allowed to be swapped out with a different racial demographic? Maybe shave off 10, 15 years, maybe a couple more. Maybe what? That is not about a penalty that you can recirculate. Let me tell you why. Because a year and a half ago, Israel busted banks in Israel to the tune of $900 million. Bam! $3.9 billion was just issued, sent by Goldman Sachs over to Malaysia. Bam! Need I go on? How many damn generics are you trying to recirculate? I don't agree with generics. I don't agree with illegal prescription, consumption, production, or distribution of unlicensed pharmaceuticals and or products that are created with processes of research and development that lacked informed consent and adhered to necessary standards regarding the product development. You can't call it a generic drug if what you're really doing is creating racial typecasting and using electromagnetic frequency in order to target people's genetic indicators in order to fuel the financing of the crypto economy. I just want to stop by this by saying, I went to a social media site based out of Russia. When you go to sign up, they have all of these categories that come up that you can agree to or you can not agree to, except the understanding is if you use this service, these companies are going to be potentially advertising to you. The one I did, there were almost 100 different crypto feeds that were being identified before I agreed to the service. How many damn medications are already bundled into the back end of things like this press release from the Department of Justice versus, I don't know, the agenda for the city council versus whatever's on the White House site at one time versus whatever's at the GAO at one time versus whatever's on your blog, or rather articles you wrote that are with publications that for whatever reason have back-end coding with numbers, rows and rows and rows and rows and rows of numbers that also happen to be tags to somebody's Twitter feed. Right? So every time you take my products and you say you're going to publish them as a journalistic matter, and then you encode into the back end line after line after line after line of numbers that if I do a search end up going to Twitter feeds for people engaged in activities including trying to present sexually provocative imagery of minors, while you've also got references in the back-end coding to uranium and the Ukraine. Are you drugging me? Are you trying to create generics of me? Or are you trying to create generics of them and using my journalistic works as an illegal distribution? Who gave them the authority to do that? And if Homeland Security had any legitimacy, why didn't they crack that down? Or rather, have we allowed certain people in the technology sector that have a particular racialized agenda to disabuse access to the actual means by which to control and to be able to engage technology so that they can genetically manipulate us into acceding to behavioral engineering and an appropriate performance of what whoever is in political leadership at the time has identified as an acceptable expression of the race or demography that were assigned at that moment. This is not about generic drug manufacturing and competition under concepts of antitrust charges. There's a difference between the Sherman Act and the Smith Act, right? And we're not talking about spies.